president of City Club. For more than 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people have come together to find solutions to our region's biggest challenges. Today, we're a diverse network of people who are eager to learn, connect, and share ideas for a better Oregon. Thank you for joining us at the Sentinel Hotel, where thousands of people are watching, listening in, and participating by radio, TV, and online. Listeners are here via X-Ray FM's website and radio stations, 107.1 FM and 91.1 FM. Live viewers are watching on KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app, and TV viewers will watch a recording of today's program via Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for the support of our media partners in bringing Friday Forum to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our volunteers and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs week after week. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. I would now like to welcome Congressman Earl Blumenauer, U.S. Representative of Oregon's 3rd District and the newly elected leader of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, to the stage. Congressman Blumenauer will introduce Professor Kimberly Clausing.
Thank you, Colin. I appreciate your comments about Dennis Richardson. We ought to acknowledge the passing of Norma Paulus, who represented a different era as well. But we are here today to hear from one of Portland's hidden treasures. Dr. Kim Clausing is a major resource for policymakers. She strips away with facts and careful analysis the myths surrounding complex international corporate taxation. She was the witness of choice for the Ways and Means Democrats and the Senate Finance Democrats over the last couple years as we navigated these areas. She's been kind enough to be one of my informal advisors for a decade. She's not just smart, but data-driven, principled, and always looking at the big picture and connections. I'm excited to introduce her here, but I'm also going to be hosting her for a dinner with the Ways and Means Democrats in Washington this month. She's going to be featured at a breakfast with the Aspen Congressional Program, and I think there may even be a policy salon or two. She's been laboring in this space with issues that have occupied me. I only wish I had her gifts of analysis and insight to be able to make it clear and concise. I'm eager for us all to have a preview of what some of the Washington insiders and policymakers will experience in the weeks ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kim Clausing.
Thank you, Earl, and thank you, Steve, for organizing this and inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be at City Club to talk about these ideas among so many of my friends and colleagues. So that's a real treat. And I can't thank Earl enough for his work on these ideas on a day-to-day basis. I feel really lucky to have had the chance to write this book, but I feel even luckier to have a champion for these ideas in Congressman Blumenauer, and I think we're lucky as a nation to have him heading up the Trade Subcommittee for Ways and Means, so thank you. So they've told me to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Today I am going to talk about our present moment in economic history and why it is that at this moment I view the administration's approach to economic policy as being basically the exact opposite of what we should be doing. And to give you the punchline first, I feel that we'd be much better off if we have an open economy that's open to trade and immigration, combined with a progressive tax system and a robust safety net. But instead, over the last 2 years, we've really moved in the opposite direction of all of those ideals, with new trade barriers, with new immigration restrictions, with big steps toward a more regressive tax system that's also deficit financed, and with a weakening of our social safety net with less security around health insurance than we had previously. That set of policies I view as particularly disadvantageous, not just for American workers, but for America and for the future of peace and prosperity. So that's the agenda for today. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about American workers, where they find themselves now, what the real issues are that created a lot of economic discontent, then turn to trade and immigration, and then end with some minutes talking about taxes, which are one of our biggest sort of policy tools for thinking about how to respond to all of these challenges. So first, let's start with what's going on with American workers, and there's two facts that you might want to mull over. The first is this big difference between what's happening to GDP per person and what's happening to the typical person. So if you look at the amount of GDP per person over the last 35 years, you'll see that there's been a roughly 60% increase in that. And that translates into about a little more than $20,000. So we have enough extra income as a nation that every person, in theory, should be able to have as much as $20,000 extra income. That's how successful our economy has been over the last 35 years. But if you look at the median household in our economy, the growth in their incomes has been much, much smaller than that, closer to 15% over 35 years. And a 15% income increase over 35 years isn't really that impressive compared to what we grew used to in the generations prior. So that discrepancy between how the economy is doing and how the typical person is doing is a real problem. And it's tightly related to the second fact that you might want to think about, which is what's been happening to income growth for different groups in society. So let's talk now about two periods. If you look at the period of 35 years between World War II and 1980, you'll see that the bottom 90% of the population roughly saw their incomes double. So that was a significant increase over those 35 years. Those at the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%, actually had their incomes grow at a slower pace than those in the bottom 90%. Now, not everything about that time was great, right? There are plenty of things not to like about the 50s and 60s and 70s, but economic inequality was actually getting better, not worse, during that time. If you compare the most recent 35 years, you'll see the bottom half of the population has seen no cumulative income growth, 1% actually over 35 years, which is basically zero. Whereas the very top have seen enormous gains. If you look at the top 1%, their gain in income has been more than 200% over that period. So what's really happened in this recent period is all of the gains in GDP have ended up in a few hands at the top of the income distribution, whereas those in the middle or at the bottom have seen less gain. So if you happen to be in the 50th to 90th percentile, which is where I am, over that period, you do see some income growth. It's about 50% for that group, but it's about half what it was in the prior era. So the middle class and those below them are really not prospering over this last 35 years, despite the fact that the economy is prospering. And so that's a real concern. Now, the first thing we might do is ask why? Why did that happen? What was different about those two periods? And one thing you could readily blame is trade and globalization. You could say, okay, well, we were much more open to the world economy in the latter period than we were in the former period, and that may have a contributing factor, and that's something we should take seriously. But keep in mind that a lot of other things have changed during those time periods too. So technology, for instance, computers and the internet and how we organize our economic activity has really changed in a way that's drawn demand away from low-income workers. So their jobs are often being replaced by robots and computerization, whereas robots and computerization might actually make some of us in this room more productive and richer. It doesn't help those at the bottom of the income distribution. But there have been a lot of other changes too. Market power is much greater than it was in the earlier era. There are fewer firms that have more of the profits and sales than there used to be. Labor markets have become more competitive. Unionization has fallen a lot. There's been a large change in social norms over that period too, and one way you can see that is in CEO pay. CEOs now make about 300 times what their typical worker makes, whereas if you go back to 1980, it was 30 times. And you know, we could argue, well, are today's CEOs way better than they were in 1980? But I don't think they're an order of magnitude better. So that does, I think, reflect our social norms. And there's also been some big changes in economic policy during that period. From 1980 to present, we've seen repeated changes in taxation, for instance, where we've changed the way we treat income at the top of the distribution, and we've been particularly generous to capital income. So all of those things are important. And one thing to note is that if you look across countries, almost every country during this period has experienced greater trade and big technological change, but they don't all have the same wage stagnation and income inequality problems that the United States has. Now, some of them have problems that are going in that direction, but we're one of the most extreme in terms of outcomes. And so what that tells me is that policies and institutions and social norms are an important mediating force between, you know, the winds that are blowing, you know, outdoors and what's truly affecting workers at the end of the day. So that's something to keep in mind as we start to talk about policy. Okay, so there's a lot going on. Workers have every reason to be upset. Unless they're at the top of the income distribution, then they should be happy. But it's not entirely clear that globalization is driving those trends. This is a storm that's coming from a lot of directions. So let's talk about trade next, because trade is one of those things that we might potentially blame for this phenomena. But as I discuss in the book, which I encourage you to buy, in chapters 3 and 5, I spent a lot of time talking about all the great things about trade, and there's a lot of great things about trade, but today I'm actually going to focus on the downsides. And we shouldn't ignore these downsides. These are important too. For instance, there was a team of researchers that found that extra imports from China potentially cost about 1 to 2 million manufacturing jobs that were lost in regions that had particularly fierce competition from the Chinese imports. And that's a lot of people, like 1 to 2 million people losing manufacturing jobs due to direct competition with Chinese imports. Okay, so that's a fact to worry about. Now, when you're worrying about that fact, though, it's important to remember a lot of things about the US economy. One is those imports are costing us jobs in one area, but it's possible they might be creating jobs in other areas, right? If you've got less expensive steel, your auto company might be more productive and cost effective than it would be otherwise, as an example. But even if you ignore that, another important feature to remember about our incredibly dynamic capitalist economy is that we lose in the US economy 6 million jobs every quarter, right? So we're talking about 1 to 2 million jobs potentially being lost due to Chinese imports over a period of a decade. But every quarter we lose 6 million jobs in the US economy. Now you might say, well, how is that possible? The unemployment rate seems pretty steady. We also create nearly 6 million jobs, or often more than 6 million jobs, every single quarter. So we live in an economy that has incredible amounts of creation and destruction. Right? All these new jobs are created, all these old jobs are lost. And that creates all sorts of transition costs, whether you're losing your job to a robot, or whether you're losing your job to domestic competition from the Walmart, or if you're losing your job because the fad that you worked on is no longer popular. All those job losses are painful, right? And they create transition, but there's also a lot of opportunity. You know, at the same time, there's new jobs that come open. Now, when we turn to trade policy, we might say, okay, well, it could be more painful to lose your job to foreign competition than it is to lose it to a robot. Now, that's possible. Another argument you can make is like, well, maybe it's not more painful to lose your job to a foreigner, but we can do something about the foreigners, whereas we can't do anything about the robots. Now, it's true, you could do something about the robots. I mean, we can talk about that with science fiction, but you know, trade, there's an obvious solution. You put up a tariff, right, and that reduces the amount of trade, whereas fighting off the robots or countering market power and social norms and all these other things, that could take a while, whereas a tariff you could do right away, right? And so that's the question is, should we do that? Would that help workers if we do that? And this is an important question to ask right now because we've been doing a lot of that lately. If you look over the recent period, there's been a big surge in trade barriers. More goods are facing tariffs than ever before. And more of our exports are facing tariffs too, retaliatory tariffs, so that's something to keep in mind. And we've also announced and started conflicts with lots of our allies as well as some of our trade adversaries to the extent that those are meaningful terms. So one question we could ask is that, will that be helpful to American workers? And the answer that I put in the book and that I think is true is that this is not helpful to American workers, and it's not helpful for three really important reasons. One, when you put up trade barriers, you actually create a new set of labor market shocks. And so let's talk about some of those. If you go and talk to a soybean farmer, which my daughter had the pleasure of doing because she was campaigning door to door during the last election season. When you talk to the soybean farmers, they are not happy about the tariffs. They're not happy about the tariffs because when we put tariffs on Chinese products, China put tariffs on the soybeans, right? And the soybeans now are piling up without being able to be sold easily, or the prices have fallen a lot because there's less Chinese demand. And that's caused a shock to the soybean farmers. If you look at General Motors, over the last year, they paid an extra $1 billion in tariffs, right? And they also announced a lot of plant closings in Ohio. If you want to be a competitive car company, you need access to your whole international supply chain, ideally without a lot of extra tariff barriers. So making products in the United States where imports are more expensive than they used to be isn't as cost effective as perhaps making it elsewhere. Harley-Davidson announced that they were actually going to start serving the European market from offshore facilities instead of US facilities. And several companies have announced that this has affected their operations in really meaningful ways. And so I guess my point here is that when you put up tariff barriers, you're not necessarily erasing the shock or the disruption that happened before, but you're creating new disruptions and new shocks that affect workers all the time. It's like this old joke that Paul Krugman once said, or it's like if you run over a pedestrian with your car, right? Like the ideal solution isn't to put it in reverse and undo it, right? There's a similar argument here, right? Because we've already adjusted to that last shock. It's not clear we should go around willy-nilly affecting new shocks. A second really important thing to keep in mind is that tariffs are taxes. They're taxes paid by Americans. They're taxes paid by American consumers, right? And in addition to being taxes, they're regressive taxes. They fall much more heavily on the poor than they fall on the rich. In fact, they've done careful analyses of US trade data, and if you look at the share of income that's paid by the bottom 20% in tariff burden, it's 3 times that of the top 20%. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is people at the top don't consume all of their income, whereas people at the bottom do. But people at the bottom also consume more import-intensive consumption bundles, right? So they might be more likely to shop at the Walmart and less likely to shop at the farmer's market, and that's going to mean that they're consuming more of the imported goods, and that tariff is going to fall especially hard on them. If you go back in U.S. history about a century, there was a big battle about the income tax. And one of the reasons we had this big battle about the income tax is we needed more revenue about a century ago. But we realized, at the end of the first Gilded Age, that tariffs weren't a really fair way to raise that revenue because they fell disproportionately on the backs of the poor, not on the robber barons or the other people who'd really prospered during that first Gilded Age. And that was part of the rationale for the income tax system, was that tariffs weren't considered to be a fair tax, and they are quite regressive. So that's a second reason that trade barriers don't really help workers. And a third reason that I would point out is international relations. And that may sound really abstract, but if you think about it, there are a lot of really pressing problems, like climate change leaps to mind, that we really need international cooperation for. And you could probably think of others too, national security issues here and there. And when you're going around threatening your allies, it's a lot harder to achieve progress on those aims. And given how many of those aims really do affect all of us in our daily lives, I think that should also be counted against these sort of trade wars as policy Final issue is, I know it's out of vogue to care about other countries, but if you stop and think about it, trade and global market access has been instrumental to their success over this last generation. The single most heartening thing that's ever happened in the economic history of mankind has happened over this same last generation. If you go back to 1980, about 40% of the world's population lived below the World Bank poverty line, which is $2 a day, roughly. So stop and think about that. That's a pretty extreme poverty line, and 40% of the world's people live below that. Today, that number is 8%, right? Now, it's not exactly that all these people are as rich as we are in America, but you know, billions of people have been raised from below that line to above that line at a time when world populations have been increasing. And access to ideas and goods and commerce from other countries is an important part of that story, and that would have been a lot harder to do in a closed economy. So openness isn't everything, but it's important. Now keep in mind the gains of those poor countries are not our loss. Remember, over this generation that they had all of that progress, US GDP grew substantially, enough that GDP per capita grew by over $20,000 for each person in America, right? So it's not clear that their gain is our loss, and in fact, that's one of the big, I think, fallacies of today's trade policy is that it's a zero-sum game, because it's not. It can really benefit everyone. And I don't have time to go into trade deficits, but there is more on that in the book. And one thing to just note is they have absolutely nothing to do with the gains from trade. They have a lot more to do with whether countries are saving or not. Okay, so I guess the picture to get so far is that trade has generated some adjustment costs. That's true, but it also generates enormous benefits, and trade barriers are more likely to harm than help American workers. So let's turn next to immigration. This one is actually even easier. There's no serious evidence that immigration is responsible for the woes of American workers. There have been, in the economics literature, hundreds of studies, and the picture is really clear. Immigration is good for the country. It's good for almost every group in the country. It's good for the immigrants themselves. There are just very few losers in this story. To give you some context, immigrants are now about 13% of the US population. That counts anyone who is born somewhere else, whether they're documented or not. The undocumented are less than a quarter of that population, and that is falling at present. And by the way, most of those overstay their visas. They don't come over the border. Immigrants are far from evenly spread out. In Oregon, our immigrant population is about 9%. In California, it's 27%. In Montana, it's 2%, right? So those are very different distributions. And one thing that you might want to stop and think about is the fact that if you look at the popularity of the immigrant population among the native population, it seems to be highest where the immigrants actually are and lowest where there are hardly any of them, right? So if you look at the states with very few immigrants, those are the ones that really don't like immigrants. So it does make you stop and wonder. Now, some feel that we have too much immigration despite the lack of evidence that immigrants are harmful, and under the present US administration, the anti-immigration policies go beyond the wall to more obstacles for legal immigration, reduced refugee quotas, and other issues. And I would point out that in the UK, for instance, reducing immigration was a big part of the Brexit impetus. So what are the dangers of these policies for American workers? I would argue there are 4 that we should focus on. One is that we lose talent and innovation when we cut down on the immigrant population. If you look at the past 40 years, the United States has won the majority, about 60%, of all Nobel Prizes in scientific fields. So let's go us, that's pretty good. But note that a minority of those, I mean close to half, but a little less than half, were won by American-born researchers. A majority of our Nobel Prizes are won by foreign-born researchers who are residing in the United States at the time. So that tells you something right there, and I could go on and on because there's 1,000 other examples, but I won't. A second loss is that we lose entrepreneurs and job creators, and the immigrants really disproportionately create a lot of jobs. 40% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants. Half of our billion-dollar startups were founded by immigrants. And immigrants disproportionately found small businesses too. So they're not just supplying labor, they're supplying jobs when they supply labor. We lose important parts of the labor force, people with really high skills. We have a lot of really high-skilled, for instance, computer scientists and engineers, but also people who fill key employment needs at the other end of the distribution, doing agricultural labor or elder care. And another important thing to keep in mind is immigrants really lower the demographic burden of the elderly, right? So in Japan, there are 8 retired people for every 10 workers, right? In the United States, there are 3 retired people for every 10 workers. I'd kind of rather be a worker in the country with 3 old people for every 10 workers than a worker in the country with 7 old people for every 10 workers, because the tax burden of taking care of the elderly, which we should do, is going to be a lot heavier when there are more of them. The reason that we have a healthier demographic ratio than Japan is almost entirely the difference in the immigration, because not just do immigrants bring more people, but their fertility rates tend to be higher in subsequent generations than the generations before them. So there are a lot of benefits, and in the book I argue that we should probably, if anything, have more rather than less immigration. Now, I want to spend some time talking about taxes, and I'm cognizant of time, so let me turn to those next, but let me recap by noting that what I'm arguing so far is that American workers really do have reasons for dissatisfaction, but neither trade barriers nor immigration restrictions are really going to be the magic elixir that helps them, and in fact, they're more likely to be harmed by these solutions than helped. So let's turn to the tax system, because we have someone here who can help with that, who works on the Ways and Means Committee, and maybe this is something that we should all be thinking about. And with taxes, let me start by telling you what I don't think you should do, and that's exactly what we just did. So the tax cuts that were just passed as part of what we call or some people call the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but officially is known by a different title. But those tax cuts were passed in a way that was really had nothing to do with reform. If you want to look for a true tax reform, go back to 1986 when an Oregon Republican senator got together with a New Jersey Democratic senator, and those two helped pound out the Tax Reform Act of '86, which passed the Senate 97-3. Did it raise deficits? No. Did it change burdens towards the top? No. Now let's look at what we just did, right? We have a series of tax cuts that was passed without a single Democratic vote. The raised deficits, the latest numbers indicate by $2 trillion over the next 10 years. That's a lot of green. And the provided benefits that were really skewed toward the top. So I think there are 4 problems with this legislation. It makes inequality worse. If you look at the tax cuts for those in the top 1%, they started about $50,000 at the beginning of the 10-year window, and they go down to about $20,000. If you look at the tax cuts for the bottom 80%, they started at a few $100s, I think up to $800, I believe is the average for that entire group. But by the end of the 10-year window, it's a tax increase, right, because they get phased out, and there's some other subtle changes in there too. So if you look at the system as a whole, we've made the tax system less progressive, and we've sort of rewarded those that have really already done really well over the last generation, while not really doing much to help those who have done less well. And keep in mind, that's all in the context of deficits. We haven't paid for those tax cuts, right? So we're going to have to either raise taxes later to offset that, right, at which point we've undone those tax cuts that we gave, or we're going to have to cut spending. And my guess is that the way we're going to raise taxes and cut spending isn't going to be distributionally is the same way that we did the tax cuts. So that's another reason to be skeptical about this helping the middle class. We also made the tax system more complicated, which is hard to do. But on the business side, we definitely succeeded in making it more complicated. The new pass-through deduction is a disaster for the lawyers in the room. Good luck. The one, you don't get it unless you really rearrange things, and 2, you might have to help people figure it out, which is confusing. But the corporate side is also filled with riddles and perplexity. So that's a big problem. On the individual side, you might think, oh, well, they made it simpler because now I don't have to itemize, you know. And that's true, a bunch of people aren't itemizing anymore, but let's stop and think, how hard was it really to itemize? You had to keep track of your charitable deductions and your taxes, right? And then you got to itemize. You know, so it's not clear that that's really the source of the amazing complexity of our system. A final fault of that legislation is it didn't address our profit shifting and offshoring incentives that were already in the tax code. Research that I and others have done suggests that we're losing about $100 billion a year of corporate tax revenue because so much of it is ending up in havens. If you look at US multinationals, half of their income is booked in just 7 havens, and these havens altogether have a population that's less than that of California. So we started with a system that looked like that, and if you look at the Joint Committee on Tax estimates of what we've done to that, we've actually lose a little bit of revenue in the international provisions. And we've got some things that attempt to plug that gap, and then we make it worse in other ways, right? And so if you take the combination of the weird things that happen in that law, it's not helping or necessarily worsening that problem. It's sort of leaving it at roughly the same size it used to be. So what would better tax reform look like? What should we tell Earl to do next? I think 3 things would be really nice things to do in a better tax reform. One is to address what's been happening over the last 35 years by trying to undo some of that through the tax system. We can undo the increases in income inequality by making the tax system more equal. We can expand the earned income tax credit to help those at the bottom. We can expand child tax credits to help those on the bottom. And we can get more serious about taxing income at the top. Now, taxing income at the top, you don't necessarily need to raise the rates much, if at all, if you're serious about taxing all the types of income in a similar way. So taxing capital income similarly to labor income. Warren Buffett has famously noticed that his secretary pays a higher marginal tax rate than he does, and it's true, she does. And that is because capital income is highly favored in the tax code, and that's something that we could undo. We could also undo this bias towards tax havens for companies, right? And then we could undo the tax preference for pass-through income, right? And if you treated all types of income more similarly, I think with a top rate that was quite reasonable, you'd still raise a lot more revenue. And the final thing I would do here is a carbon tax, which we can do in a progressive way. But a carbon tax is the single most beautiful, if I might say, economic policy that I've ever seen, because it takes a problem that's enormous and it incentivizes absolutely every actor in society to do something about that enormous problem. So when you're trying to decide, should I fly to see my cousin's wedding, you're not thinking about the carbon tax, or the carbon price. But if there were a carbon tax, you would, because it would show up in the plane ticket. Because you'd be like, oh, well, it's actually a little more expensive to go to Kansas than I thought. Or if you're a company deciding whether to make a green building, right? If energy is more expensive, then you'll think about that when you're making your green building. Or if you're trying to decide whether to innovate in new energies, right? If the old energies are more expensive, that gives an incentive for the new energies. It also raises a lot of revenue. Would you rather raise revenue by taxing something that's bad, like carbon, or something that's good, like our labor, right? I would much rather tax the bad thing, right, than the good thing. And so you can combine that with progressive changes to the earned income tax credit, for instance, or even you could even rebate the carbon tax back to people as on a per capita basis, and the majority of people could be better off by that combination. So I think that that's something that we should be thinking about very carefully. Okay, so let me conclude with just a couple closing thoughts. If we look at the past couple years of economic policy, they clearly represent a shift in our priorities towards a much more nationalistic framework. If you go back to Inauguration Day for Donald Trump, he made one salient promise to the American people. He said, we're going to put America first, right? And then he just said that kind of over and over again in that speech. But he's also said that over and over again since. And his version of America first seems to be a very nationalistic policy that involves higher trade barriers, higher immigration barriers, withdrawing from international commitments, and the like. Unfortunately, he's not alone. This sort of economic nationalism has shown up elsewhere. Britain, with Brexit, the reason that they undertook that was in part because of great dissatisfaction with EU policies on trade and on migration, right? Poland and Hungary have embraced more nationalist policies. Brazil just elected a very nationalist president. And I think this rising tide of nationalism shouldn't be ignored. It's dangerous. The last big era of globalization and income inequality that we had was 1870 to 1913, and it ended with 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And not to depress you, but I think economic discontent is something that we should take seriously, and it creates a situation where nationalism is more attractive than it should be. This nationalism is dangerous to peace, but it's also dangerous to prosperity. And most important, I think, blaming foreigners for our problems really distracts us from some simple, elegant things we could do to solve those problems. I've talked about taxes here, but there's some other ideas that I have in the book too that I think would be far more direct at going to the needs of American workers. So this moment in history is a really important time to get economic policy right, and I know we can do a lot better. So thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions.
For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Colin Jones, and we're here today with Kimberly Klossing, the Thurman Miller and Walter Mintz Professor of Economics at Reed College. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it up high for City Club staff to collect. You may also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag Friday Forum. City Club members are welcome to ask a question at the microphone. When it is your turn, please introduce yourself, identify yourself as a member, and ask one question in 30 seconds or less. We prioritize this space as one for dialogues, not monologues, so please do keep it brief.
Hi, Paul Milius, City Club member. It seems to me that the basic problem is we have the best government money can buy. Candidates at all levels of government spend an inordinate amount of time raising money to finance their campaigns, which are admittedly expensive. Thusly, they cater to the people who have money and can make the largest donations, and those people use that to influence policy through their donations. What would you suggest as a way to reduce the influence of big money in American politics?
Yeah, so I have a lot of ideas there, but and I put out a few of them in the conclusion of the book, but I think campaign finance reform is the most dreamy idea of them all. I say dreamy in that I think it would be wonderful, but it's a little hard to imagine, but I do think it would be really useful. Another thing I think that we can learn from Oregon, and I also say this in the book, what I think Oregon does best, aside from maybe Pinot Noir, is voting. If you look at how we vote in Oregon with automatic voter registration and with the mail-in ballots, I think that provides a reason for people to get more engaged, and it helps counter some of the influence of money if everybody gets actively engaged. So I think that I wish every state voted the way that Oregon did, and I think that actually is more quick and easy to do than campaign finance reform, but I'd love to see campaign finance reform too, of course. Yeah.
Please.
Hello, Roberta Palmer, City Club member. Just a clarification, you were saying the United States creates 6 million jobs a quarter, and yet our jobs reports that come out every month on a really good month is maybe 300,000. So what's the discrepancy there?
So every quarter, and there's actually a graph in chapter, I'm not trying to really get you all to buy the book, but there's
You're giving it all away.
But there's a graph in chapter 2 or 4, I forget which, that shows the net is the job creation numbers that you get every month, but there's an enormous gross of a big loss and a big gain. So for instance, during the 2008 and 9 recession, the typical month saw much more job loss than gain, but the net was what's reported in those news headlines. Now we see maybe 300 extra thousand jobs in some months, right? And that's because we're creating more than we're losing, but there's big grosses underneath those nets.
Thank you.
Dave Goldwasser, City Club member. Between technology change and imports and and large number of other factors, there's been a lot of change, disruptive change in the nature of our workforce, what people do. There's often a major mismatch between skills people have and what's demanded in the market. Things change. Some communities are very hard hit by factory closings. Do you have any thoughts about what could be done to mitigate this? That's the one thing I've not heard from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think that one thing we need to do is have more sort of flexible lifelong learning. Again, in Chapter 9 of the book, I talk about some of the ideas, but one of them is, for instance, free community college, I think is very helpful because people can access that sort of education and training programs that we have in community colleges at any point in their life. And often community colleges provide education and retooling options that are sort of geared towards job opportunities in the local community. So that's one helpful step. In the near term, I also think wage insurance could make sense, where if you have a job and you lose it, but you get another job, that the government could make up some of the difference on a short-term basis to help people make some of these adjustments, because I think those are quite costly. In terms of preparing the next generation of workers, I think we need big investments in education and making education more affordable, but also in thinking about it throughout one's childhood. I think there's a lot of gain to be had even from early childhood education, sort of the 0 through 5 years. We're not investing enough there, but we can also strengthen public education in the K through 12 and beyond.
I'll take a question from a card. So there is fairly vigorous opposition from the left to some free trade agreements, driven by concern that it's bad for workers. How do you persuade progressives that, say, open trade agreements like NAFTA drive down wages and incentivize labor exploitation? How do you persuade progressives like that to support free trade?
Yeah, so our trade agreements are really interesting, and NAFTA is such a whipping boy for so many things, right? I mean, people just kind of look at NAFTA and they pin everything on it. One thing to keep in mind with NAFTA is that our trade barriers were already very low before we got in that agreement with Canada and Mexico, and so it was inherently asymmetric agreement where they were lowering their tariff barriers much more than we were lowering ours. The same would have been true with TPP should we have been part of that. So often what's really happening when we're joining these agreements is more of a political thing than an economic thing. We're not really changing our rules for receiving imports very much, but we are sort of working with other countries on sort of creating a trading system that could hopefully lead to prosperity for all. I think where the left is right to be worried about trade agreements is in two areas. There's an investor-state dispute settlement area where arguably we've given too much power to companies relative to governments, and there's no reason for that to necessarily be part of a trade agreement. I also think intellectual property, we often take the interests of pharmaceutical companies much more heavily than the interests of workers when we negotiate these agreements. So there are ways to make these agreements more modernized, to really encourage countries not to lower labor standards, for instance, and encourage countries to maintain, or if not strengthening, their labor and environmental standards. And interestingly, TPP included some of those very things, but was rejected after a debate with almost no substance. I mean, and almost no debate, really. It was just like, it was another thing that people could trot out and complain about because it sounded like global capitalism run amok, but it was actually just kind of a kinder, gentler trade agreement that really didn't do much at all. Like, in a way, trade agreements aren't that important economically for the United States because we're already pretty darn open to trade. They're much more about some of these other aims.
Please.
Barbara Dudley, City Club member. I want to elaborate on, or I would like you to elaborate on what you were just talking about, because I do think that the criticism from the left about the trade agreements was not so much about tariffs, that tariffs were being lowered under GATT and nobody was worried about that. But what the WTO, well, not nobody, but what the WTO and NAFTA did that I think really alarmed, along with the intellectual property, was also the investment measures. It was really about the movement of capital more than the movement of goods. And I think that has never been addressed by the people who defend these trade agreements. And I think that that's been a devastating part of what has happened. I mean, along with the agricultural agreements and the, all the other non-tariff barriers that were lifted or that were imposed, really.
One thing I would say to that is that I do think that we can use trade agreements as a healthy way to help harmonize some of our policies upwards rather than downwards. And by harmonization, I don't mean that every country would pick the same tax rate, because I don't think that's appropriate, and I don't think every country should have the same minimum wage. But I do think there are some simple common sense things we can do to prevent havens, for instance, from taking the tax revenue of other countries. And some of those things are easier to do when you negotiate them multilaterally with other countries involved. And one way you can get countries to the table is by having trade as a carrot to offer as well, right? So if a country wants market access, you can use that as a way to help negotiate less tax competition, right? Because you can sort of imagine, for instance, if the transatlantic partnership had gone forward, that would be a natural forum to work on some of these tax issues, because the EU is really worried about tax avoidance too. We are. If we got together and we set some common understanding of what the corporate tax base looks like and got serious about protecting that base from erosion to tax havens, that's something we could do really well collaboratively, especially if we were getting along, right? Which would be easier to do if we weren't threatening them with trade wars and if we had some carrots to offer as well. So I think there's room for much sort of like healthier versions of trade agreements that include some things that we haven't included yet, and maybe get rid of some things that we shouldn't have included in the first place. So I would be for a more modern version of that.
I'm Bill Harris. I'm a City Club member. In your judgment, is there then a form of NAFTA 2 that is worth proceeding to set up?
I'm sorry, a form of what?
Is there a proposal regarding NAFTA from now on?
Oh, regarding
that
NAFTA?
you feel could be supported, or is it a situation where there are a lot of nice things to do, but they aren't necessarily there, and therefore it's not worth it?
Yeah, well, I kind of like NAFTA more than a lot of people do. So, I mean, again, I think in a way NAFTA is really easy to blame for a lot of other things that we don't like about the world. Like, I don't like environmental degradation, and I don't like when labor doesn't have enough power. But it's not entirely clear to me that restricting trade with Mexico is going to help either of those things, right? I mean, I think making Mexico a little poorer doesn't strike me as the most direct way to that. So what I would rather see is use sort of NAFTA as a leaping off point to move towards something like the TPP, for instance, which I think did have more environmental and labor protections within it, more enforcement teeth within it. I mean, we walked away from that agreement, but that agreement was an attempt to modernize NAFTA. Now, it also included some things I wouldn't necessarily have included, like some of this intellectual property stuff, but I think there are ways to make these agreements a little more friendly without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, I think just blowing up NAFTA, I think, is a very unsatisfying thing to do to really some of our neighbors, our closest trading partners, people we'd really we have got global supply chains and North American supply chains that are very dependent on these countries. I was at a trade forum with some folks in Earl actually last year, where we heard about Oregon companies who had some production in Mexico and some production in Canada, who sold to those markets, who really had an integrated North American business operation, and to just sort of throw up a bunch of sand in the wheels of their business because we think it'll indirectly help some other aims doesn't necessarily strike me as ideal. So I'd like to keep a version of NAFTA. I think that USMCA, or sort of NAFTA 2, or whatever you want to call it, is kind of a silly reworking of something that, I think we could have done that a little better, but I still think it's better than nothing.
Carol Witherell, City Club member, thank you so much. What do you see as the impact of mass incarceration on economic and other forms of equality, notably racial equality. With the current recidivism rate and costs of incarceration, with little investment in restoration and other forms of rehabilitation, such as mental health?
Yeah, those are wonderful questions. I'm not an expert in that area, but the little reading that I've done suggests that we have huge problems there and that we could do a lot better. It's quite clear to me that the justice system as we've had it is not providing equal treatment for different groups, and that some of our laws have led to way too much imprisonment relative to the severity of the law. And marijuana is one example where, you know, if you ended up getting caught with a little bit of that, you could end up facing, you know, jail time in a lot of places. And it's not entirely clear that when they enforce those laws that it had equal burden on, for instance, white and black people. So I think that's an area where we could do a lot better, but I have to warn you that I'm not an expert in that area whatsoever. So this is all just based on me reading. Yeah.
Thank you.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Professor Clausing, Eduardo Porter read a piece recently where he said the tax code is on the side of the robots. He said that actually there's tax advantages to companies for investing more in automation rather than investing in workers. So I just want to know, is he right? And can we do something about it?
Is he right?
And can we do something about it?
Does the tax code advantage automation?
Oh, does the tax code automation? Yeah, so something about the microphone, it's kind of, but that, does it? So it definitely advantages investment in general, right? So if, for instance, right now we have complete expensing, so any investment you take, you're basically getting a zero tax rate on the normal return to that capital. So if you buy a robot and it just earns the normal return to capital, that's tax-free. If it earns above that, of course, you'd fall prey to the corporate tax. And so if you think about it, we are encouraging every form of investment, including automation. And one reason to be, I guess there's so many reasons to be skeptical that corporate taxes are going to trickle down to the level that they've been predicted to trickle down. But if you think about what they're arguing is they're saying, okay, if we cut corporate taxes, companies are going to invest more. If they invest more, that's going to increase the productivity of labor. And if that increases the productivity of labor, labor is going to get paid more. And each one of those steps has reason for us to be a little suspicious. Like, it's not clear that cutting corporate taxes is going to lead to more investment. And in fact, if you look at the recent data, there's been more oil investment that has to do with the oil market, but there's not been a big surge in investment, partly because the companies that are feeling the benefits of that tax cut already had a lot of cash on hand. They were already highly profitable companies who could have invested as much as they saw fit to do so ahead of time. So that's the first link. Will that investment increase demand for labor, or will it replace the demand for labor? That's another really good question. A lot of investment is displacing labor demand as well as is encouraging it. So that's another reason to be suspicious that trickle down may not happen. And a final reason is, do workers get to then capture that increase in productivity if they indeed have one? And I think given the changes in our labor markets, we also have some reason to be skeptical there. Labor markets are much more fiercely competitive than they used to be. Labor seems to be losing power relative to management in our economy, and so if you wanted to combat that, there's a lot of things we could do better in terms of labor laws that were more encouraging to union rights, but also in terms of supportive measures like things that would help workers directly, increases in the minimum wage potentially, or expanding the earned income tax credit, wage insurance, things like that. But also addressing the market power of companies directly themselves. We've really seen a big increase in the power of companies, and this has a big effect on labor markets too. We used to think of market power as hurting the consumer ultimately because we imagined monopolies jacking up prices. But another thing that monopolies do is they exert a lot of power over local labor markets because they are controlling entire industries or parts of industries or labor markets themselves, and so they get to set the wage. And so I think thinking more carefully about modernizing our antitrust laws to make labor a bigger priority would be a really useful thing to do in the coming years.
So we are nearly out of time. My last question for you is that, many elected officials have spent a lot of their careers tackling one of the three issues that you've named, and you're like, hey, Earl, could you deal with all of these immediately? And so if we assume that Congress isn't going to act quickly on trade and comprehensive immigration reform and a whole new tax reform, what, briefly, would you say is the highest priority? Where should Earl start?
Yeah, well, I really think the tax code is an incredibly powerful tool. So I would be really tempted to start there. Between the international things, I would certainly put immigration ahead of trade. I mean, I think we already have a pretty free trading system. Assume we don't screw it up. We don't, I think I would settle for not doing damage in that area. But immigration, I think it does have some pressing moral elements to it. There's a lot of people who have undocumented status that I think we could be kinder to, and I think we could set rules for new immigrants that I think were better. And so something like the DREAM Act or things like that I think should also be really high on the priority. So I hate to keep people like Earl up at night, but I would like to I would like to do more than one thing. But if I had to pick one, it would be, it would be taxes, but immigration would be really, really important too.
Excellent. And with that, our time is up, and we'll have to pause the conversation. Please join me in thanking Steve Novick for producing today's program, Earl Blumenauer for joining us and introducing our speaker, and Reed College professor Kimberly Clausing for sharpening our understanding of current tax and economic policy. Thank you.